Okay.
Right. So the next speaker is ready.
Okay. So, hello. I'm going to be talking about upgrading 100 developers to Drupal 8. So yeah, talking about upgrading to Drupal 8, but not the software, the people. So a quick rhetorical question: who works with Drupal? Yeah. Who works with other people who also work with Drupal? Yeah. Great. Who works with people who will eventually be working with Drupal 8? Okay, yeah. So you're in the same situation as me. So I'm also working with quite a few people who work with Drupal, about 100 of them. I work with Wunderkraut. And we are in this process of kind of switching from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And yeah, it doesn't happen like that. You need to have some kind of plan. You need to work on that. How do you go from having like 100 experts in one system to have 100 experts in a system that's somewhat different? So that's what I want to talk about today. There's one slide that I use for pretty much every single presentation that makes it really easy to reuse those slides. Yeah, the question why. So why do we want to do that? I mean, that's a good question, and you might think, well, Wunderkraut, of course, we have Drupal at our root. Yes, there, like you haven't noticed, the carrot of Wunderkraut is actually an upside-down Drupal. And by all definitions, we are a Drupal shop. We don't present ourselves that way, we don't see ourselves that way, but we are a Drupal shop. But first, the decision to go from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, it was not just, well, let's move to the next, just the next version because that's what's coming. We actually had a slightly indirect route. So if we take a step back in the past, about 1 year ago, we were working with a system, Drupal, that was kind of old, 4 years old at the time. We knew it very well, but we knew also all the things that it was terrible at. We knew especially it was not very good for building real applications. It was good for websites, but you know, there's a bunch of things that made it difficult to work with. And so we started looking at different technologies throughout the offices that we have, throughout the teams. Some people start looking at Node.js, some people started working with Symfony. We also did a lot of very cool front-end stuff with Angular. And we realized, well, this technology is great, but we're kind of going in different directions. And when you have teams in multiple places, in multiple offices, this is a problem because it means that you could have a company that just has a strategy, technical strategy that kind of goes everywhere, and that's bad. And so 1 year ago, we decided that we should do something about it. And so, no, we didn't call Captain Drupal. What we did actually, we created what we called a technology task force. So we got some lead developers from the various offices, the various teams that we have, and we sat down to kind of figure out, hey, what do we want to do about the technology thing? And we realized there's two things that we wanted to solve. The first one is that we wanted to have some kind of framework that let us build applications, and not 5 different frameworks. We wanted to have one, something that worked for us. A side problem that we also had is that, well, Drupal is great, but it's not very good for simple sites. You mentioned before, yeah, for simple stuff, maybe WordPress is better. And so we were also thinking, well, can we do something about that as well? And we had a lot of different discussions. We considered many different alternatives. And in those discussions, there's one idea that really stuck, that really stayed with me. That was from my colleague, Tomi, who's the lead developer from our Finnish office. He said, well, Drupal it's good for site building. It's a good tool for that. It's also a decent programming framework. The problem is that when you mix the two, when you try to do programming with site building, and that you just mix different kinds of tools, and that's when it gets really ugly. And so he kind of inspired me to, well, think about Drupal a second, like give Drupal a second chance. And so we thought, well, maybe Drupal could be potentially this thing that solved that problem. We just need to look at it a different way. And so we gave it Drupal 8 a try. That was the first project that we did. That was in April. It was a very specific kind of site. It was a controlled risk that we took at the time, and it turned out to be fantastic. And so as time went on, we did more and more Drupal 8 work, and yeah, it convinced us. And before I talk more about the aspect of introducing programmers and developers to Drupal 8, well, it's one thing to have the people who can do the work, but you also want to make sure that you have the product. Because, I mean, if you have a bunch of people who can do something that you can't sell, that's useless. And so we did a workshop on how do you sell Drupal. And the main thing that came out of that for me was like, well, Drupal 8, it fixes our problems. There's nothing that you can do with Drupal 8 that you couldn't do with Drupal 6, Drupal 5. I mean, you can do REST services. We had WYSIWYG before. We've been building sites that scale. There's like, what is really new in Drupal 8 that you couldn't do before? Nothing. And so how do you sell Drupal 8? There's nothing to sell. I mean, if you look at it pessimistically, Drupal 8 is a bug fix release. So it fixes stuff that was broken before. But yeah. But the flip side of that is that, hey, Drupal 8 actually fixes all the problems that we have. And so it's our job to inform our customers, say, we want to be working with Drupal 8 because it makes us much more productive, and this means that you get a lot more value for your money, you get much better software. And so for me, Drupal 8 really changes something for us, not for our customers, and that's something that's quite important. So what does that actually change for us? And that's the what. So I'm going to go back to this idea from Tomi. There's the site building stuff, there's the programming stuff, and there's also the stuff in between. So site building stuff. If you look at Drupal 8, and this is actually something that someone mentioned before, well, it doesn't change that much. The concepts are still the same. There's still content types and blocks and all of that. There are some changes, but really, I mean, it looks better, but it's nothing really different. One thing that is quite different, though, is that when you start building, you realize that you can do a lot more with Drupal core. And also, it's not that you can do more, but the core is much more consistent. And so you don't need a lot of modules to kind of adapt those small things that core is doing not entirely completely. And so I have this very scientific graph that shows like the number of contrib modules that you need for Drupal 7 for an average project. And as you can see, for Drupal 8, you need a lot less. Yeah, and it means that, well, you need a lot less, but a lot of people, when they're thinking about starting their first Drupal 8 project, they look at all the modules that they used to use, and they look at Drupal 8 and say, well, nothing's there. It's not ready. No, you don't need those modules. You don't need display suit. You don't need, sometimes you need display suit, but it's really for the edge cases. And so you can really do a whole lot of things with just Drupal core and also with custom code. And this is the next part. Drupal is now a solid and serious application development framework. In Drupal 7, I couldn't find the source for this, but there was this fantastic blog post that defined the average day of a Drupal programmer. Which is like, yeah, I mean, I have spent years building this kind of stuff. Yeah, I can say that's true. You spend doing a lot of time working things that's kind of trivial, and then the part that makes you very valuable is that you can solve really obscure, weird stuff. And I have to say, this is really, I mean, this is the biggest, the most important slide for me in this presentation, that Drupal 8 results in happier programmer. I've been much happier in my job writing Drupal 8 code than Drupal 7 code. And it happens the same thing to everybody else who's been working with me in other teams, in other projects. Yeah, we learned to do something. We are like, you know, it's a skill. It's a career to write code. It's a fun one, and to write something that actually, yeah, that is done properly, it's more satisfying. And if you're more motivated at work by what you do, you're more productive. And I think this is a huge improvement. And this is something that, yes, we should not underestimate this. Drupal 8 makes us more motivated at work because we do something right, and then that means that we can be much more productive. Even if it's only because of that, it's already worth it. And because Drupal 8 is now building on proper practices, object-oriented code, nicely structured stuff, it means that you can use an IDE and suddenly, hey, all the stuff that, like the things that you needed to look up in the documentation before, now it's at your fingertips when you type, it's autocomplete there. So if you're working with Drupal 8 and you're not using an IDE, or if one of your developers or your colleagues says, I'd like to buy a PHP Storm license, go ahead, buy it. It's absolutely worth it. Not sure you could have said that in every case for Drupal 7. Now it's definitely the truth. Bojan also mentioned Composer before. We use that not only for some modules, we actually decided to use it for everything. We have a full Composer-based workflow. It means that you can use Composer to download modules like the devel module. You can say, well, of course you could do that with Drush downloads. That also works very well. But it means that with exactly the same kind of tool, you can also download additional libraries. For example, the Elasticsearch integration library, or any kind of PHP library, really. It means that you can integrate tools from different external stuff very, very easily. You don't necessarily need one Drupal-specific module to do something. And that means that you can do things that are simple. And there's this the great presentation from the author of Clojure, the programming language, about the difference between simple and easy. What we've been working on with Drupal is making sure that things are easy, so that you can just click together and you can create a listing that has arguments and aggregations. And you know, if you look at the views interface, it's all meant to make things easy. But it's extremely complex, but it's easy. You can just click things together. And I think a much better strategy is to make things simple. So maybe you don't need the entire Drupal integration stuff. You don't need, for example, a search API. Just last week, we did one project that has some very advanced features integrating Elasticsearch, and it's about 100 lines of code that also uses the Elasticsearch library. We put data in our index. We have some very specific logic with it. We get data out of the index, autocomplete. It's fantastic. And it's a lot less lines of code than using Search API, a lot less complex. We have access to all the functionality, and it's something that's really maintainable. And so I think we need to reconsider also the need for contrib, the need for integration stuff that just like makes things easy. Just because you don't have a configuration form does not need that it's complex. And if we assume that we have people who can write code, then maybe it makes sense to optimize for that rather than to optimize for people who can write code and who know the UI like the back of their hand. Having code that can be really structured like that also means that it's testable. And it means that, well, yes, you will need to write tests because the kind of code that you write can be testable, and so it makes a lot more sense to integrate that in your standard practices. This is something that was pretty much impossible with Drupal 7. You could write like integration tests where you really click through everything, but these tests are really sensitive and they give you like false negatives, and they're really expensive to maintain. And what we see is that now that we have proper services, proper objects that really encapsulate the business logic, it's suddenly possible to have very specific unit tests or integration tests at service level that give you something that's extremely solid. And for us, there was this idea in between, well, do you want to be doing Drupal and Symfony kind of side by side? So we would be doing Drupal for the project, for the websites, and then we could also use Symfony for the application-like stuff. And we were considering this, like these different possibilities, and what we ended up in pretty much every single case where we were looking at this possibility is that it's better to have Symfony development, to do Symfony development with Symfony component inside of Drupal. You have the routing framework, you have the controllers, the services, dependency injection, all of that, all the tools that you would need and that you would use in a Symfony project. And you can also, at the same time, you have user management, you have permissions, you have the backend, all the stuff that you get from Drupal. And actually, for me, one of the big enlightening moments was when I was talking with Symfony developers and people who have been working with Symfony for years, and they tell me that Drupal is a better Symfony development framework than Symfony itself. And I think maybe there's some truth to that. And when we look at the kind of projects that we are now building with Drupal 8, there's things like this. This is a website that only has a backend. 7 is the front-end theme in this case. And we're building really complex applications that deal with data structures. We are also using fancy visualization libraries to build, like, to let us see complex data structure, to implement complex workflows. And at the same time, we are still taking advantage of everything Drupal has to offer. So we have something that's really, it's combining the best of both worlds. You have the flexibility of Symfony. You can write really nice unit-tested code, and at the same time, you have your users. You have a good-looking backend by default. For this project, we didn't have a front-end developer. We just created a button, and oh, it looks great. Created a form, it looks great. All of that. So these are all the things that you don't get by default when you're working with Symfony. And so this is really something that's quite exciting, and I think it's not only about learning to do Drupal 8 for the same kind of project that we did before, but it also means that we now have a technology that lets us do completely different projects and do kinds of projects that we wouldn't have been competitive for before. So that's Drupal 8, the site building stuff, Drupal 8, the programming stuff, and then there's the gray zone. And I think for Drupal 7, the gray zone was the ugly part. I mean, it's a thing where there's like nasty stuff going on. And we like to make analogies with Drupal, talking about Drupal, it's like Legos. You can have components and you put them together. And actually, if you look at a reasonably complex site for Drupal 7, it kind of looks like that. Yeah, it's Legos, you have components, but actually you have things kind of going on like in every directions. And there's things like that we called best practices. I'm not sure if you can see that, but the quotes are in bold. So there are things like we call them best practices, but it's only best practices for the Drupal insiders. Things like, oh yeah, you can reuse views. And so you're going to create what is actually a SQL query, and you're going to store the SQL query as a structure in the database, and then you're going to export that as a serialized PHP object that you're going to save in a module. And when you activate that module, it's going to write that thing back in the database. And it's like, have you ever tried to explain the workflow with features to a non-Drupal developer? And I mean, you talk to Symfony developers, for example, and they look at you and it's like, this is, yeah, I'm not sure what this is. And so what we have there really is we are mixing different levels of abstraction and having dependencies between those levels. So we have views, for example, that we create at the UL level. It's really configuration. And then we make references to those views within a module. And then there's really, like, we have no concept of what is where. And this is really what results in things like that. And this is what makes Drupal 7 project unmaintainable. And the thing is that if we're not careful, we can do exactly the same thing with Drupal 8. There's nothing forcing you to do things correctly. And so I think what is possible with Drupal 8, you can actually have those proper layers. But you need to make sure that you build stuff correctly and that you're aware of those dependencies. Things like having configuration or having modules that depend on configuration. Like writing a module that knows what kind of content types you have or what fields you're going to have on those. This is generally a bad sign. So you want to make sure that, well, you have a core API. And then you have those modules that build on top of that API. And then the configuration should be actually taking the place of what we previously called glue code. So you create components, you create plugins, you create formatters, and then the configuration takes that and puts them together. But there's no dependency, there shouldn't be dependency from the code on the configuration. And then your theme that is in charge of making everything look good, yes, the theme can depend on the configuration and on the modules. But you want to make sure that you're not putting dependencies that go up the tree. So this is something that, yeah, having some general principles like that, it actually makes it possible to write really well-structured code that is also going to be very easy to maintain. And then how do you get these kind of practices? How do you apply them to your team? Well, when you have a large team of developers or any kind of people, you're going to have those that are like really into it at first, and then there's going to be those that come later on. And it's important to know the difference between these people and to treat them, well, not treat them differently, but to be aware of those and of those changes and to be, yeah, awareness, I think that's the right thing. And so for the very early ones, the first that, like the people who really want to, hey, let's get into this, make sure that you support that. Make sure that you let them go to conferences, make sure that you let them like have a look at what's happening, let them experience, let them go to code sprints. And I think it's important, well, not only to just be very involved in the Drupal community, it's, well, go to these kind of events, and you know, it looks quite, well, you know, it could be a Drupal meetup. This is actually a Symfony meetup. And we should remember that we are integrating new practices. For example, everything related to Symfony. It's something that's new for us. It's new for pretty much anyone doing Drupal. But this is stuff that has been common practice for all these developers. And we can learn a lot more by going a little bit outside of our comfort zone. Go to the PHP meetup, go to the Symfony meetup, and you're going to be amazed. They're really nice, you know, and they know a lot of stuff. So I can definitely recommend that. Get involved in those communities. There's a lot to learn. Yes?
I just wonder, in your company, how much time is it kind of realistic to allocate for like non-productive work?
I think it's really difficult to say because I think that also has to do with this. Well, for those people, I mean, we have people who like spend weeks at a time working on just contribution stuff. And there's some people who are not really interested in that, and they're going to spend less time. So we try to, I mean, it's not like there's like a set percentage of your time that's going to be dedicated to that. And we also want to make sure that we try to mix that with work or customer work. So we want to, we want to be very transparent. We tell our customers, okay, we're doing this with Drupal 8. This is something that's slightly new. It might take us a little bit more time, but here are the benefits. And while we're doing the project, we're also going to submit patches. And I think most of the patches that we've been submitting, let's say most of the patches that I've been submitting were all related to project that I was working on. And so I think it's not necessarily, it's not like black and white, what is community, what is work. I think it's really healthy to have some kind of mix of the two. So go out, see what's out there, learn. And as you learn things, well, you learn new things, but you also need to kind of reconsider the current practices that you have. And I'm sorry if I'm going to shock people, but these are some of the common tools that we had before. And yeah, features, don't use it. There's a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to go into the details, but yeah, stop using features. It was never meant to be used what you use it for, and we don't need to do that anymore. People are really, really attached to it. And whenever I talk to, I've been going around our offices doing Drupal 8 trainings, and this is a question that comes over and over again. So how do you do features? You don't need features. How do you installation profiles? Well, are you creating a distribution? No, then don't use installation profiles. If you really want to create a new local installation based on your exported configuration, use the config installer profile. It lets you do exactly that. You don't need to create your custom installation profile because it was never meant to be used like that. Also, drushmake, stop using drushmake. This is, it's worked okay. It was a workaround for a long time, but no, don't use drushmake. Use Composer. It's actually going to solve a lot of things. It has a small learning curve. It's going to take maybe an hour or two to get used to it, and you're going to learn how to do things in a different way. I think the most common question with Composer is like, how do you apply patches? Like, well, you can. There's a way to do that, but patches are also a broken thing. Maybe you should not be using patches to do this kind of changes. Maybe just use pull requests or like modern tools. So make sure that you question the tools that you're using, especially in this initial phase when you're pretty much like you're settling the best practices for how projects are done. And it's really important to do it now, because when you do the second project with Drupal 8, you're going to copy what you did for the first project. And then when you do the third one, you're going to copy that again. And so the best practices that you set on today will probably be something quite similar to what you're building like 2 years from now. So spend a good amount of time making sure that you are using the right tools. and explore new possibilities, and yeah, reconsider the tools that you've been using so far. And then there are new tools like the Drupal console. Most people are like, well, do I really need it? Is it, I mean, we haven't had the Drupal console for Drupal 7, and it wasn't, well, it wouldn't have been that useful. And it turns out, well, it really is very, very useful, and it shows you how to do stuff. It's great learning tool. It's great for documentation. You would say, well, I want to create a new formatter. Drupal console generate formatter, and then you have something that just generates all the code for you, and it's really useful. It's really clean. That's yeah. So make sure that you consider what can be done. What tools do you have? And what's particularly important, especially if you have a large organization, is that you want to seek consensus. You want to make sure that you have people in different teams working the same way. And it doesn't take a very big organization with offices in different countries to get out of sync. I've seen this happen with, like, you have two teams in one office working next to each other, and then wait a couple of weeks, and then they have different practices. So make sure that you seek consensus, that you try to align yourself, that you talk about what you're going, what you're doing, about what works, what doesn't work, and you want to make sure that, yeah, people are aware of what's going on, and then if there's enough communication, the alignment will get there by itself when you see what is the best solution. And I think that this is something that is particularly yeah, we have a big chance to do that, because Drupal is known for having like 25 different ways to solve one problem. And it turns out that sometimes there's one solution which works out a lot better than everything else. For me, Composer is one of those solutions. At the moment, well, for Drupal 7, we have different ways of building code. Mostly with DrushMake, but DrushMake never had an official way. How do you create a project? It does, well, a multi-step thing. DrushMake has something to create a distribution, but it's like, because it was never meant to build a project, people have found different workarounds. And it means that we have different processes in Finland and in Belgium and in Sweden. And with Composer, suddenly we have one way to do it. And how do we build a project? With just one command. Composer install. What that eventually triggers, well, it does the usual thing of just installing third-party code, so modules, libraries, Drupal core. We also use that to trigger the compilation of front-end code, gulp, Sass, whatever you want to use. Also to import configuration from the exported configuration. Also to perform database updates. And suddenly we have one command that we execute to deploy a site. And it doesn't matter if it's on platform.sh, it doesn't matter if it's on our own hosting in Finland, or if it's going to be on a top secret thing that's specific to a customer. And suddenly we have a new tool that everybody agrees on, and that simplifies our processes. So when you discover something that works really well, make sure that you share that. It's going to make a lot of things a lot easier in the future. And then we get to the bulk of the team, and what you want to make sure is that you expose everyone. So you will definitely have a couple people who are really into Drupal 8 at the beginning, and having a couple experts that don't talk to the rest, that's not going to be valuable, or it's going to make things quite difficult. And what you want to make sure is that you share the knowledge, and you can share it in a very passive way. So what we decided, for example, is in our chat room, we decided not to have a specific Drupal 8 chat. We just said, well, any Drupal 8 discussions will be in the development chat. Yes, a lot of people will be seeing things that is not relevant for them at the moment, but they will be seeing what kind of stuff is going on, and then when the time comes to actually do their first Drupal 8 project, hey, then they will have been exposed to it. And yeah, so you want to make sure that that people get reminded on a daily basis. There are people working on Drupal 8 at the moment, and yeah, and you want, well, having this kind of knowledge means that they will know who to talk to, who they can ask when they have a question. So this is something that's really, really useful. And then for the ones that need a little bit of a push, you want to encourage them, and you want to make sure that you have clear responsibilities, who can help who in a project, and make sure that for anyone who's starting a Drupal 8 project who hasn't had that kind of experience, make sure that you involve the people from the first project, that you involve people who can really provide the support that's necessary, so that you can really have the same kind of quality when you're starting a project with people who, well, maybe don't have that much Drupal 8 experience, but you want to have the same quality as with the top experts that were involved from the beginning. And so having mixed teams and really even just a little bit of advice on how to set up things properly, that's really, that's all it takes. Because Drupal 8 is really easy to learn, actually. It's just, you need to know how to have the initial setup, how the initial conception that is done right. But actually, when you need to solve a problem, it's like, how do I build breadcrumbs? You look it up, there's an interface, it's clearly documented. We very rarely see people that are stuck on something that they can't do. Usually it's, yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier than with Drupal 7. And this is something it's not only easier for Drupal developers, it's also easier for developers from the outside. We've done projects with Symfony developers who, after 1 week, they were able to work completely independently, doing great work. And this is something with Drupal 7, usually we used to say it takes about 6 months to go from like not having any experience and being, well, maybe not an expert, but proficient enough that you can really work on anything independently. And I think this is huge, but it also means the other side, the flip side of that is it's also very easy for non-Drupal people to just get in the market. And I think we're going to see a lot more competition from non-Drupal shops. And I think the big advantage of being the Drupal expert, that's going to, yeah, it's still going to be an advantage. It's going to be a much smaller one though. And I think that as Drupal shops, we need to prepare for that, and we need to make sure that we have other convincing arguments why we should be doing projects besides just, hey, we know Drupal. For me, I had a moment this summer when I decided, well, I'm going to make an optimistic goal. I'm going to say no more Drupal 7 projects starting in 2016 for the entire Wunderkraut group. And I thought this would be quite optimistic. With 100 developers, that can take a while to train everyone, to get all the best practices. And I have to say, I've been surprised because it was a lot easier than I expected. And we've actually reached that point now that nobody is starting any new Drupal 7 projects. We still have some existing ones, and of course we're still working on those, but we've really reached the point where we are in a position to say any new project that comes in, it's going to be on Drupal 7. There's really all the, well, there are arguments against using Drupal 8 and in favor of Drupal 7, but when you consider the sum of the arguments, what is in favor of it, what is against it, it's very clear that at the moment it would not be professional for us to start a new project on Drupal 7 unless it's something that's really, really tiny and really small, and then even then, hey, then we could actually do it with Drupal 8 without any problem. So I think it's, yeah, the transition is easier than you think. It takes some time, some effort, but once you're past it, you will never want to go back. Yeah. Any questions? Yes?
You mentioned building consensus. How do you do that? Do you think more of like a QA, quality assurance role with code reviews and things like that? Discussions? Is it a top-down approach or bottom up? How much is managed? I mean, you're a lot of people, so it's.
Well, we are a lot of people in different offices and different cultures, and also with a very flat hierarchy. So top-down does not work. And people from Belgium do not like when Finnish people tell them what to do. And the other way around, it's the same thing. Especially because Finnish people are really, really direct, and Belgians are like and so that's that wouldn't work. So it's really more like bottom up, and at the same time, kind of like the top down part is really more of inspiration and coordination. So saying, hey, you're doing this, well, you should talk to this guy because he actually did something quite similar and it worked out really well. Maybe you want to take inspiration from that. And so it's coordination and consensus through awareness of what everybody's working on. And what we're seeing, for example, with Composer is that it took a good amount of work to just make sure that you talk to every team about how do you do that, and that you make sure that anytime a project gets started, that you spend an hour with the team saying, okay, well, this is how it works, this is how you do that, this is how you work with the configuration import, and then if you have something that's convincing, then people will generally accept it. And I think that's the problem with Drupal 7. That's like it was kind of convincing, and there was like some stuff that was missing, and the stuff that was missing was solved in different ways by everyone. And so that's I think the fact that the system is consistent and clear, it certainly makes consensus a lot easier. Yeah. Yes.
Did you guys keep some kind of wiki or something that says this is how we do stuff, or is it only like kind of verbal communication?
No, we do have a wiki. We call it the Wunderway. So it's a public set of pages that's hosted on GitHub that describes everything from like the way we do project management, the way that we do sales, and if we decide if a project is a good fit for us, to actually how do we deploy code, how do we approach design in an agile process, all these details. So yeah, we talk about that, and this is public information. Yeah.
Do you manage to sort of, is it working and kept up to date or?
Yeah, so it's hosted on GitHub pages, and so that means that if anyone thinks, well, this is out of date, they can just submit a pull request. We have some conversation about that, and we'll ask someone else to review that, usually someone who knows if that makes sense. And so we have the same kind of interaction that we have around code when we do code reviews and peer reviews. The same thing happens internally for information.
Yeah, really interesting to hear about the transition here. Could you elaborate on the push or the non-existing push from the customer side? What are the customers thinking in here? So the customer, the customer doesn't know or doesn't need to know. So we're transparent, but it's not like, usually you don't ask your customer if you're going to use like display suites or context or panels. I mean, you are the one who knows. And so we treat it like in a similar way. We say, well, we are considering this and this. This is the thing that we're going through, but it's more communicating what we're doing and less asking for advice or for permission. So this is, we actually
There have been some cases where people come to us and say, well, we want Drupal 8, but that's actually a minority of the cases. Yeah. Yes?
So there's always been this conflict in Drupal between the two sides, where one is configuration driven and one is code driven, and your talk really argues in favor of the code driven approach, which I feel like is the zeitgeist of the community right now. So what I was wondering is, does Wunderkraut actually have pure site builders, and if yes, are you planning to downsize their number? Because it definitely feels like you will be doing less and less clicking as time passes.
Yeah, well, I think I don't think we have any pure site builders. We have like various mixes of people who are more site building and just a little bit of coding, and then people who are like front end that do more styling than PHP. But we don't have any site builders as such, and we count on everybody like at the company or anybody involved in the creation of a project that's going to be using the command line, using Git. So this idea of a non-technical site builder, we don't have that.
Right.
No. And I think that it's something that in terms of hiring, in terms of like the hiring strategy, it's going to change. And we have one problem, and this is the same problem as every Drupal shop. Like, where do you find people who do Drupal? I mean, either like they work for the competition or they work for you, but there's no like Drupal experts that are available somewhere. And now that we see that actually it's quite easy to learn Drupal 8, and it's a lot easier to learn Drupal 8 than it is to learn like good programming, and it's certainly we see that we can be an attractive employer for a much wider talent pool, and that's really exciting. Okay, and a little bit of a hint. So you saw that slide from Captain Drupal before. Captain Drupal was that hero that appeared for DrupalCon Munich. That was 3 years ago, almost 3.5 years ago. And so next week on Thursday we are releasing Drupal 8, and apparently he's coming back. So, yeah.